Good morning, everyone. We are continuing with our Why Blue? Why Blue? Why Blue 2? This is Why Blue 3. And I think I'm going to finish the general conversation about this today. And then in the next probably 3 sessions, I'll go through, or 4 sessions, I'll go through the vows, the various vows. But we'll see. We never exactly know what's going to happen. So let's start with the prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Show us the way to find the fulfillment we seek by following the path of divine light. Help us to have the clarity and the courage and the willpower and the common sense to follow the path in such a way that we may live in joy, ever expanding joy, until everything in our consciousness becomes thy joy. Om. Peace. Amen. Today I'm wearing the right color blue. This is the dyed to the palette exactly color. I was looking at the film yesterday just to see it, and yesterday was definitely a much darker shade. So it's just, there is a quality to this shade of blue. And since the question was why blue, again, everything that I'm talking about is talked about at great length here, and there's also a website, Renunciate Order for a New Age, which I haven't looked at the website recently, so I'm not 100% sure what's on it, but there's lots on it. This book is very deep, and it's a very serious book, so you really want to be ready for it. You don't want to read it if it makes you feel like you're inadequate on the path. That's what I'm trying to say. You have to. I was actually, after the broadcast yesterday, I was having a little conversation with the 3 people who sometimes help make this happen, and I was talking about how there were just certain rules of the spiritual path that were master's rules, but I never thought they applied to me because they were just so far beyond me. It would just make me crazy even to imagine. And it was interesting in conversation with my peers over the course of many years what trouble some people cause for themselves by hearing a very high teaching and then imagining they were supposed to do it. So this is why Swami calls it the art and science of Raja Yoga. Raja Yoga is the integrated path to God realization. There's the science of it. These things are true, but the science has to be coupled with the art, because if you don't apply it appropriately for yourself, then it far from making you more advanced, it puts you in a state of suppression. And even in the Bhagavad Gita, I mean, I say even in the Bhagavad Gita because that scripture is hundreds of years old, before Freud and all of the psychology that we talk about now. But Krishna says, what is the point of suppression? There's many different translations, but the meaning is very clear. To suppress something is not to transcend it. And you suppress it when you really don't, your experience does not tell you that it is, let me try exactly how to say this. We're still enjoying it on some level. It doesn't make us happier to renounce it than it does to indulge it. Now, happy is a serious word, because a lot of times discipline does require willpower. And I'd rather eat the whole quart of ice cream, but I know if I do that these things are going to happen to me and then I won't be happy. But that's what your mind says. It's like, yes, it would taste good for half an hour, but I know how I would feel an hour after that. So even though you're tempted, you're not seriously tempted, because you can remember at the same time that you're remembering the pleasure, you're remembering the other side of it. But there are other experiences, sex being the biggest and the main one, where it's only a dim theory that this is not good for you. And as long as it's only a dim theory, what we have to do is we have to be honest and conscious. actually in the book Ask Asha, and I know I don't mean to just be always propounding my own books, but I did work hard on them. And I was asked a question here, and I don't know where it is, but this young couple, and very honestly wrote to me and said, celibacy, ha ha. And it was basically about what they could say. They could read all they wanted to that Master said about, the purpose or lack of purpose and the importance of transcending this. There's a tremendous amount of magnetism between us, and they're a wonderful couple, and it's a very it's not a surprising reality. Honestly, if there wasn't that kind of magnetism, probably people would never get together because it's just not worth it. It's too much trouble. But so what I wrote back to them, and I think was a very helpful answer, and I didn't make it up. This is the things that Swami said, is all right, let's talk about why the masters, and they all say it, tell us that we need to transcend this. I mean, let's start with, we need to transcend everything about the material world. We need to understand that the more we're looking to the spiritual world, the happier we are. And this isn't because the world is sinful. It isn't because God hates us. It isn't because suffering is what we're supposed to do. None of those things. It's because we're happier. We're happier. The freer we are, the more we have broken down the chains of limiting self-identification. When I was, before I came to the path of self-realization, before I met Swamiji, when I was just trying to figure out what was wrong and what I could do to fix it, I mean, being a human being, um, it was only after I came to the path of self-realization that I realized that it was the extraordinary sense of confinement that I was living in, because I was so deeply identified. The soul had identified with the unique body, and then the ego had defined itself in all these different ways, and it all felt so small and so constricted. It wasn't until I discovered changing your consciousness. And then my solution had been, when I was like in my teens, is that the one meaningful work I could think of was to raise children. I was inclined toward children anyway. I was a camp counselor, and I did creative dramatics with children. I enjoyed children. So I thought, being a mother, I thought that was an honorable profession. I thought it was something that you could do independent of society. I was a little naive, but that's what I thought. So I thought I would have lots of children, 10, 12 children. I had lots of energy. When I came to the spiritual path, and it was interesting. Like being a mother was just like, womb, that was what I was going to do. As soon as I came to the spiritual path, I realized that what I wanted was self-expansion. And what I wanted was to refine my character, and merely multiplying physically was not really going to either make me a better person or actually really substantially change my inner awareness. And just like almost from night to morning, I just flipped over. From motherhood being the definition of my life goal, I just didn't matter anymore. Because this is what I'd said when I spoke in some class about never having to compromise my ideals in the 50 years since I met Swami. But I've often had to reform them based on a deeper understanding. And this was a very good example of that. The ideal that I was hoping to achieve by raising many children, I've held to, absolutely. But I realized that was not the way to get it, that I got a higher way of achieving it. So with sexuality, I mean, there's many things that cause it to bind us, not the least of which is this constant reminder that you have a body and you have a gender. And this constant sort of this personal interaction where somebody thinks you're really special and you think they're really special, and you're just sort of always trading this back and forth about how really marvelous each of you are. And just sort of 1,000 things. Swami also, when I asked him, what is the advantage? What is the downside of not being celibate? He said, it leads you to believe that desires are there to be fulfilled. And he said rather than that desires are there to be transcended. Now that's a very complicated, subtle point on the spiritual path, which newbies often grab. In one of my very early attempts to convert, I was the typical newbie, and I grabbed overcoming desire as the most important thing because I didn't have a brain at that time, but I could still talk. So there was an acquaintance of mine, and I was trying to convert her to the spiritual path. So I was trying to win her by logic by saying, you know how it is when you want things, like you're really restless for them, and then you finally get them? Yeah, so she says, I know exactly how that is. Okay, so this is number one of my six. So I've got this. So then you finally get them, and then after you have it for a while, they're not quite as satisfying. Oh yes, I know how that happens. That they don't quite live up to the promise. Yes, yes, I know. Oh goody, I'm just like we're almost there. But then she looks right at me and she said, that's why it's so important to keep on wanting new things. In other words, if one desire disappoints, then just move on to the next one. We're unclear on the concept here. We've got the basic principles, but no. But that's, where most of us are. It's like we're just not ready because we haven't had the experience yet. But we have the experience. We live through the fulfillment. And we find that it's not horrible. It's not like it's ugly. This is part of God's creation. I'm going to say even more that's positive. It just is what it is. That's all. It just is what it is. And, is this an eternity of bliss? Not quite. Also, because age sets in, physical infirmities set in, excitement dies, this person becomes familiar to you, on and on and on. A friend of mine, I have to tell this is so funny. A long, happy marriage, and I'll just leave it there, and it still is. It's a long, happy marriage, and they married relatively young. And her husband is one of those men who just basically doesn't have he just doesn't see the world, and nothing about the material world, really. He just doesn't notice it. And so, uh, as a consequence, honey, do you like this new dress? Oh, it's fine. Should I cut my hair like this or should I wear it like this? Oh, I don't care, whatever you do. Do you like this new shade of lipstick? She could never, ever engage him in anything that she wanted to engage him with in terms of her being an attractive woman. But as the years passed and she became a slightly less attractive woman, gained a little weight, got a few wrinkles, hair began to thin, all these things, the tremendous advantage of her husband's attitude, that which had been a drawback suddenly became an advantage. But you see, anyway, you play it all out like that. And it just is what it is. But on the other hand, it's the magnetism between a man and a woman and the constant exchange of magnetism that sexuality represents, especially if the foundation of the relationship is elevated, so that sexuality supports a higher cause rather than being the end in itself. And of course, what's absolutely destroying our society today is this absurd, I think the only word I can think of, lie that's being told to everyone about the importance of sex. I mean, sex is something, and it is, as Swami writes in here, after survival itself, it's the second most powerful impulse that the human being has. Viktor Frankl who wrote this marvelous book called Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a very innovative, creative psychiatrist who created a whole school of psychiatry based on the search for meaning. And he was an Austrian Jew when the Second World War broke out. He had just begun his career. He was brilliant, and he was put in a concentration camp. And he had a beautiful wife and her mother. They were a wonderful family. The women died right away. He survived and came out of the whole thing and then had a long life and career afterwards. But even I think he was in Auschwitz. He was one of the few survivors in the camp that he was in when they were finally liberated. But even there, going through this whole thing, he never ceased being a doctor. So not only was he experiencing it, he was also observing it. He was observing both himself and he was observing all the other men. He was observing the psychology of everyone, which is where he came up with his psychiatric theory that a person can endure anything if there is meaning in it. If you can find meaning in it, that's what gives you the strength to endure, to survive for the sake of your children or whatever it might be. I have to tell this story because it's so touching to me. in his book, he writes about a patient who was sent to him. I'm out of the concentration camp, and I'll come back to it in just a moment. A patient who was sent to him, and he was an elderly man who was a widower, and he'd had a beautiful marriage, 50 years of just a wonderful life partnership with his wife, and she had died. And he was so depressed he couldn't bring himself out of his sorrow, and so his friend sent him to see Dr. Frankl. So Dr. Frankl lets him talk about his wife, and then Dr. Frankl says, um, "You and your wife were very close, weren't you?" And the man says, "Oh yes." He said, "Did you take care of her?" "Oh yes, I. It was my joy in life to just smooth the path for her. I took care of everything." And then Dr. Frankl said, "Well, it would have been a great hardship for her if you had died before her, wouldn't it?" And the man said, "Oh my, I don't know how she would have been able to go on without me there to take care of her." And then I have a hard time always telling this. Dr. Frankl said, "Well, you spared her that suffering, didn't you?" And all of a sudden the man saw that whole picture, that the sadness he was going through, if he hadn't been experiencing it, she would have had to experience it. And all of a sudden everything changed. And as the story is told, he didn't say anything else. He just stood up, shook the doctor's hand, said, "Thank you, Dr. Frankel," and walked out. It's just amazing. Now, going back to the concentration camp, Dr. Frankel said he was astonished that these men who were deprived of everything, who were worked almost to death, who were three-quarters starved in the worst possible conditions, he said the sexual desire was still there. He said it was just amazing to him that it could, in those circumstances, that it could still persist. But that's where it is, and that's the way we're made. So this is not something like chocolate ice cream that you can just kind of casually say, "I'm going to transcend this." We have hardly any idea what it means to transcend this. We can't just casually start. In fact, Swamiji said something to me once that was really quite amazing. He just made the comment. He said, "I think the biggest problem in devotee marriages is sex." Now, because I often said things that were grossly inappropriate, I said one of those. I said, "Well, sex as a problem in marriage, there isn't a very original idea." You would think with the devotees you could come up with something else. Swami, of course, didn't bite with my stupidity. He just continued as if I hadn't spoken. And he said, yes, he said, but this is what he said. He said one or another of the partnership decides that sex is a temptation to be overcome. They cease to see their partner as a friend. They see them as someone who's trying to pull them down spiritually. He said, and it's all downhill from there. I mean, on the other hand, you would think, oh, this is a good thing. And I remember another occasion after the monastic life at Ananda, after 10 years, it shifted. I write about this in Light Bearer. It shifted, and I was referring to it. A lot of the former monastics got married. I often told people the best preparation for good marriage is 10 years in a monastery. Most of the people in the monastery, that's not a really good way to be in the monastery. One of the men who married one of the women who'd been in the monastery all that time complained to the woman who'd been in charge that his wife had never learned to cook. I mean, this was all in good, and he sort of was chiding her for never teaching her to cook. And the still nun said, rather dryly, "I never knew I was training her to be your wife." Just like that. It was all good-natured, but nonetheless, that was the truth of the matter. But of course, there was a certain amount of transition and confusion that had to take place while people sorted that out. And basically, Swami heard that one of the men who had been in the monastery for a long time was basically more or less trying to hold to the monastic life. Not just in the question of sexuality, but just even in the question of withholding himself from his wife, just, remaining impersonal and monk-like. Swami was not pleased. Instead of saying, yes, that's the right attitude, he said, you're not alone. You're not making decisions alone anymore. This is a partnership. If you did not want to be married, you shouldn't have gotten married. It just has to be done. It's the way it is. I remember Swami making a certain comment, during the time that he was a householder, and when that ceased to be appropriate for him and he went back to the solitary life, he commented about how, when you're married, you have to talk to your spouse in the morning. And you just don't get to meditate in the same way that you do if you live and wake up alone. I mean, these are the conditions. You can't just pretend that you're not doing what you're doing. You have to do it. It has its own rules, and you have to run through it in its own way. And for most couples, and it cannot be a solitary choice, sexuality is an important part of it. For a lot of people, it's the reason they marry. I mean, not the only reason they marry, but it's part of the reason they marry. Because, as Swami said, most people need to be married. I mean, there's really only a few people who are happy celibate. Most people need to be married. Swami writes about it beautifully in this book when he talks about, the advantage of why married couples can be part of a monastic order, because it's the way in which sexuality can be overcome is the steady monogamy of one relationship. And it teaches you what you need to learn, often better than merely enforced restraint. So when I was saying to this young couple that wrote me, I answered here, what is the basis of your marriage? What is the basis of your relationship? If sexuality just makes you more and more confined to the two of you, that's the ego strengthening aspect of it that you don't want. If it's a way of uniting your spirits so that you can walk out into the world and have this power that comes from the deep support you're giving each other, then it becomes a positive dimension. And rather than limiting your consciousness, it will gradually expand it. So you just think about it. The word I want to use, and I used it in our prayer today, is common sense. When Teresa of Avila was setting up her convents, it was 12 women who were, once the gate clanged behind them, it was perpetual cloister until they died. And so, as Mother Teresa said, great care must be exercised in selecting those 12 women, because they're going to have to make peace with each other. And she said, the first quality to look for in a good nun is common sense. She said, even devotion can be learned, but if someone does not have common sense, they won't know how to live this kind of dedicated spiritual life. So sometimes what people think of as zeal and idealism lacks common sense. And what Swamiji has been trying to set up with this monastic order, above all, is something that is grounded in reality, that is grounded in this age, that is grounded in what centuries of spiritual work actually really show to be effective. And yesterday I was talking about how Swami talked about it being just, between us and God. And to come back literally to the color blue, the traditional color of the Swami order is this orange color, which is the color of fire, which Swami explains, and he explains it beautifully. He said, that it's there because you're consuming all your attachments. Everything is being burned up. But he said it also, orange is an outward looking color of authority. And he talks a lot about colors in this book. It's really wonderful. I'm not going to repeat it all. But he said, blue is the color of the Christ consciousness. And blue is a more serene color. And blue is a color more of experience. It's not so much imposing your will on others. It's not so much standing strong like the color orange. These are subtle things, but they're true. When we dress in the blue color of Christ consciousness, the emphasis is on where we're going. And the attachments that we necessarily have to leave behind in order to achieve that will come as a natural consequence of our focusing on the expanded goal. And it's just a different orientation, because Kali Yuga, which is where the Shankaracharya order came from, was very rigid in its form. So either you were in the world or you were not in the world. There was no blending of spirit and nature as there is now. And so the blue of the sky and the blue of Christ consciousness, and the idea that you can be a totally dedicated spiritual person and still be in partnership. When you think back to the ancient sages, they were almost all married and had families, because then we went through Kali Yuga. Now I'm going to just throw in one more overall part of this so that I can, the next time we talk, I can start talking about the vows that Swami offered himself. At the end of this book, Swami has an appeal, and he appeals to sannyasis everywhere, all Swamis. And this is where he says some things I've already said, like he doesn't want this to be an Ananda order. This is a reformation of renunciation for the new age. And he speaks about Adi Shankaracharya, and Swami just says bluntly that he believes Paramhansa Yogananda was Adi Shankaracharya. He was the one who set it up all those years ago. Swami says he believes that he was there with Shankaracharya at that time. So the founding of this order is, like everything else Swami has done, it's just carrying forward Master's work. I had known that Swami had said that. I honestly didn't remember that he just wrote it so flatly in this book. So it's there's a reality about Swami Kriyananda that you either accept that he acts on Master's inspiration or you don't, really. When Swami took up to edit Whispers from Eternity, I always look backwards to see if I can put my hand on the book. Master's book of poem Prayer Demands, Whispers from Eternity, which came into the public domain, and Ananda Publications was going to put it out. And we were going to do an exact reprint because that's the way you can do it when it comes into the public domain. It was literally in galley form. It was ready to go to the printer. That we had already promised it to the bookstores. It was really set. We had a printing date. So he starts reading it, and he says, I felt Master was telling me that he wanted me to edit it. And then he refers to a couple of reasons why he really felt that was true. I had helicoptered in for the occasion, as I tended to do. And so he started editing it, and I started typing the manuscript for him. He edited faster than I could type. I believe it was his birthday weekend. He was extremely busy. He edited the whole thing. That's the book. It has a black cover. It's the one that we put out with lotuses on it. Many people were quite upset that he did that because this was Master's book and they loved it the way it was. My answer was either Swami actually genuinely, when he says, I feel Master wanted me to do it, is speaking a truth, or he's misguided. And you sort of have to take it one way or another because he either is or isn't what he appears to be. It's obvious where I fall on the issue. And besides which, I thought he improved the book, but that was even extra. Because Master's, as Swami said, his images, he was so exuberant in his images. He said, he would start out in a yellow submarine and suddenly we would be a lark soaring over the air, and then we would be diving in the deeps, and then we would be on a little motorboat. I mean, we're exaggerating, but he said the sheer exuberance of Master's devotion would just pour out. And Swami just clarified, and in some cases simplified. And he was extremely careful, but it's all in Light Bearer, so I won't say more. But in this case, Swami just states, Master was Adi Shankaracharya, I was with him, and Swami's life was spared so that he could do this. And when you really stand back and think of it, oh my goodness. I mean, he just felt inwardly that he was supposed to do this. He was supposed to fix it. If Master were here, Master would have fixed it. And now Swami has a new order for a new age because Master came to set a whole tone. And in our exuberance to kick aside the old, we have been in serious danger of diluting the entire spiritual path into, as I was saying, I think a couple of sessions ago when I started this, just because it feels good does not mean it's spiritual. And for the same reason, just because it feels awful does not mean it's spiritual. There's a middle ground, but the ego must be transcended. In a practical, effective way that actually works. But nonetheless, we cannot lower the top of the mountain or everything about the spiritual path will come to pieces. Swami himself even said, as he said to me, this vow, and I agree with him completely. From my 10 years of experience now, I'm more than 10 years into my last 20 years, which is what I was thinking of when this started. And I absolutely say that becoming a Nayaswami, becoming a true sannyasi, which is where I started, 50 years ago, becoming a true sannyasi I can't, there's not enough words to speak about how important and wonderful it's been for me. These are real things. And when I talk about the vow, I'll talk about it. And even for the sake of Ananda, Swami said, I mean, the great danger of Ananda is that it will become so beautiful. And there will be so many beautiful communities, and life in those communities will be so wonderful that we'll forget why we're there. And part of why, not only for Ananda, but not only for Ananda, having this picture once again of the full potential of the spiritual path in terms of uh, embracing infinity and liberating ourselves from the ephemeral. It's very important that it always be in front of us, whether we're living it ourselves or merely see it exemplified. It helps us never to forget. So, God bless you.